All right, guys, we're going to go through this first part of cell respiration, harvesting chemical energy. So, what cell respiration basically is it's turning the food that you eat into actual energy for you to do things. So, food in and of itself doesn't necessarily contain any energy for you to do something. We have to convert it from that organic form into a chemical form that our bodies can actually use. So the energy that we eat is stored in those organic molecules. That's why we need to do biochemistry first, because then we're talking about carbs, lipids, proteins, and we know that those fuels are going to be our carbs and our lipids. Specifically in this unit, we're going to talk about carbohydrates, even though lipids also do give us a little bit of energy as well. So when we're harvesting our energy, we are always going to kind of consider everything glucose because through the process of digestion, your body is going to turn all the carbs that you eat into glucose monomers. And it's going to be our ideal molecule for the catabolism to produce ATP. So remember, anabolism is building and catabolism is breaking. So this is a catabolic process where we're breaking down something to make something else. So the formula for respiration down here that you guys should know and memorize is glucose plus oxygen equals carbon dioxide plus water plus energy. And we can think of this as breathing in and out. Obviously, you're not going to breathe in glucose. I don't want you to go snort pixie sticks or anything like that. That you get from your body. The oxygen does come from your breath. And with that in mind as well, carbon dioxide and water is also released through your breath. We don't typically think of water as being a byproduct because it's something that we need. However, there are some animals, if you look up the kangaroo rat, for instance, that live in the desert, that's actually able to use that water in their own metabolic processes and not breathe it out. We as humans have not evolved that far yet, and we don't have that ability, but some animals do. So down here, this is basically a basic combustion reaction. So for those of you that have chemistry already, we have our carbon-based something plus oxygen making CO2 and water. It's a basic combustion reaction. We do give off a little bit of heat in this reaction, but we're also making ATP. So when we're harvesting energy from our fields, we're going to digest very, very large molecules and kind of chop them up into smaller molecules. We're breaking bonds or moving electrons around. This is the part where it gets a little bit hairy. As far as cell respiration and next photosynthesis goes, you guys are only going to be concerned with what goes into each process and what comes out. However, one of our big outcomes is the reduction or the oxidation of different molecules as energy carriers. So when we are moving electrons around, they carry energy. That energy is then stored in another bond and it's either released as heat or it's stored in an energy molecule like ATP, FAD, NAD, all of these energy molecules that we're going to learn about. So just like in regular chem, we have two different types of reactions that we call coupled reactions that work off of each other. So if we lose an electron, that is oxidizing. Oxidation is loss. When we are reduced, that is gaining electrons. And that's usually a little bit backwards for some people. However, we are reducing the charge because electrons are negative. So if we're adding an electron to something, that is that molecule being reduced because we are lowering the charge because electrons are negative. So in biology, when we move these electrons around, electrons don't move alone because if you had just free electrons floating on your body, you would spontaneously combust. And we obviously don't want to do that. So we are always going to move, or I shouldn't say always, because whenever we say always in biology, there's something that doesn't follow that rule. We are typically going to move electrons as part of a hydrogen atom. So when we see hydrogens being shuffled around, that is the oxidation and reduction of these different molecules. So down below, if we look at the actual formula for cell respiration, we have CH and O. So the H in the glucose is moved over to the oxygen, okay? That oxygen is reduced then to water, and the glucose was oxidized into CO2. When we lose something, that is oxidation. When we gain something, that is going to be reduction. I've always heard oil rig, OILRIG. Oxidation is loss, reduction is gain. So think about that when we're moving all these molecules around. So when we're looking at all of these individual molecules around, we're going to have some brand new, I like to call them hydrogen taxis. So one of the hydrogen taxis that we have is NAD+. NAD+ will take a hydrogen and be reduced into NADH. FAD plus 2 will be reduced to FADH2, and that's our reduced form. So basically, these are just two different molecules, just like how we have ATP that kind of carries phosphates around for energy. These are taxis for our hydrogen atoms, and they're going to be very, very important, especially as we talk about the very last process in cell respiration. With oxidation and reduction, we also call these coupled reactions. And the reason why is because they always go off of each other. You have to have an oxidation or to have a reduction, and vice versa. So as far as all of these reactions go in respiration, we are releasing energy by breaking down molecules. So we're breaking carbon-to-carbon bonds. We're stripping electrons off by removing the H's, and we're oxidizing that fuel. We have to input oxygen because oxygen is going to be an electron acceptor. That is very important. Star that, underline that, circle it, sticky note it, print it on a t-shirt. Oxygen is the ultimate electron acceptor. That molecule is going to be reduced into water at the very, very end of the process because it's the most electronegative atom that we typically are going to have. That process is going to drive our synthesis of massive amounts of ATP, as we're going to see later at the end of this week when we talk about that last process. So just to kind of sum up everything we just talked about, oxidation and reduction. Oxidation, if we're adding an oxygen, typically it's oxidation. Duh. If we're removing an H, we're removing it. Oxidation is loss. Oil, that's going to be oxidation, removing an H. Loss of electrons, that is going to release energy, and it's going to be an exergonic process. So that means that it's giving off energy. Reduction, removing an O. If we add an H, so we're reducing that charge, gaining electrons, that is going to store energy because we want to be able to store energy in that final ATP molecule so we can use it later and controlled in our bodies. So just a kind of an overview, and then we're going to work on the POGL next of cell respiration. We have 4 basic metabolic stages in cell respiration. We have 2 main categories of cell respiration, anaerobic and aerobic. Anaerobic and aerobic. So anaerobic means without oxygen. That is going to be just using a process called glycolysis. Glycolysis. Glycogen. Lysis means to split. This happens in the cytosol of your cell. So we think of that as a cytoplasm. It's really the cytosol. And that process happens without oxygen. So bacteria that live in anaerobic environments, like wounds really deep in your skin, they can do this process. And this is what your body does whenever you don't have enough oxygen. So you are going to go into anaerobic respiration, and the byproduct in your body of glycolysis is a little tiny bit of energy, but also lactic acid. So we also call this in our bodies lactic acid fermentation. If a molecule, or not a molecule, if an organism of yeast does this, we call that alcoholic fermentation. Instead of lactic acid, they make alcohol. The process that we are going to look at way more in depth is aerobic respiration. So this is respiration using oxygen. This process goes from the cytoplasm, or the cytosol, into the mitochondria. This is where we get the most ATP bang for our buck using aerobic respiration.